Innovative Farmers is designed to support farmer-led research and knowledge exchange. It works by joining farmer groups and researchers together to generate knowledge that farmers themselves want to know, and often works on projects that they have asked us to look at. In the last 10 years, we have run over 100 different field labs on areas ranging from compost teas, mastitis typing for cows, thistle control. We've done a trial on the alternative to glyphosate, terminating cover crops. We've even done a trial on music for laying hens. All the results from this project can be found on our website, which is innovativefarmers.org. You will have to log in, but once you've logged in, you can free access to all of the trial reports and the projects as they're ongoing. So a massively useful resource. This trial that we're working on here is a living mulches trial, and the aim is to investigate the potential of a living mulch to provide for both organic and conventional farms a way of reducing pesticide and fertilizer use, a way of reducing tillage for organic farmers, and it's sort of looking at all the different management options that are available for the farmers, which range from use of livestock, use of fertilizer, use of chemicals, and mechanical control methods. It's a loose amalgamation of farmers. We have 9 farmers involved in trialling, 5 of whom are organic, 4 of whom are conventional. We also have a wide range of farmers who are part of a WhatsApp group and are following and trying it themselves on their own as not an active part of this trial. Obviously, from an organic point of view, if we can find a way of reducing our need to cultivate and till and plough, we know that has benefits on soil health. For the conventional farmer, we know that cover crops are massively important, but there's a cost associated with getting them in the ground in the first place. Difficulty, particularly in the northern parts of the country, where there's just not a big enough window between harvest finishing and drilling the next crop to actually get a meaningful amount of cover. But we know the beneficial effects of these cover crops, so we want to investigate these things. This trial itself is supported by Innovative Farmers, which is supported itself by the Prince of Wales Charitable Fund, Waitrose, Dutch Organic, the Soil Association, LEAF, Organic Research Centre, and Innovation for Agriculture. We also supported in this particular trial by Cotswold Seeds, AHDB, who are acting as coordinators, and also Organic Arable, who have sponsored the trial. So the trial details, really what we've done is all the farms involved, we've planted a mixture of 2 different clovers. One is Aberas, a small leaf or micro clover, and the other one Aber Pearl, a small to medium leaf clover. The mixture was determined at the beginning of the trial as probably being the most likely, but we are, for obvious reasons, looking at a very unusual new environment. The mix is designed to be low growing and not intended to be competitive against the combinable crop, so just provide a low level cover. It was drilled in the trial at 9 kilograms per hectare into cereal crops in spring in 2020. Again, as part of the debate through this trial, the feeling is that this is possibly a high seed rate. But again, we're working in the dark a little bit. Unfortunately, of all the trials we tried, only 2 of the originally organic crops were actually successful. And particularly in the conventional crops, although the clover germinated, it didn't survive. The suspicion here is it's either through too thick a crop canopy, or there may have been residues from previous nitrogen and fertilizer uses. There were no pre-emergent chemicals used and no evidence of any chemical cause of the lack of germination. So in the autumn of 2020, on the 2 farms where it was successful, rye or oats were drilled into the living mulch. And as we can see the picture on the left, this is an example of one of the farms in Shropshire. The drills used were either a horse pronto, which is the one on the left part of this picture, and a Simtech, the one on the right. Alternatively, on the other farm, it was a cross slot that was used to drill. The clovers had been grazed or topped between harvest and drilling, but in both cases, there was a concern that we would be overdoing it. The seed rate for the cereals was the same as the normal farm practice, and the fields were harvested in August 2021. The result of a trial is we want some outcomes. So we have 3 graphs showing some of the trial results from this particular year. So the first 2 organic farms, looking at weeds, and in particular, the effect the living mulches has on the weeds. In both of these organic farms, they used a harrow combs to control, and in both cases this year, weed control has actually been very, very effective, which therefore shows a slightly bigger increase. But the results demonstrate that we have an increase in perennial weeds, which obviously include grasses under a living mulch, but there is a significant decrease in annual weeds. And this is something that we interestingly look at going forward. Annual weeds are the sort of problem we get in organic farming. Perennials are there managed through the farming process. As far as the grass weeds are concerned, the monocots and the dicots, there are more monocot weeds in the living mulch than dicot weeds. And it's again something interesting to see the effect this is having on the plant and the crop. The other interesting aspect of doing trials on farms with a variety of farmers is on one of the farms, because he direct drills anyway, and he doesn't normally direct drill his organic cereals, he decided to direct drill this particular strip. So there's one strip in the field that's direct drilled next door to a living mulch area, the control beside that. What we found that there were more weeds found in the direct drill plot than in the living mulch plot or in the control. Bearing in mind that there was no weed control measures of any sort, so there was no grass harrowing applied to any of the trial plots, so we would anticipate slightly more weeds. But what this demonstrates is that the mulch does reduce weed germination. Much more significantly, we have the question of yield. And again, we're able to make a comparison between the direct drilled organic strip and the living mulch organic strip. And the effect of the change to direct drilling, which again, we know from everybody else's farming work that changing to direct drilling from a cultivated farming system does have a reduction. We had approximately a 20% reduction in yield. The living mulch itself affected another 20% reduction in living mulch in yield. Slightly disappointing, but again, we acknowledge that one of the points we haven't done is there's been no management to the living mulch in order to release the nitrogen that's been created. We were just hoping that we would get a synergistic reaction between plants, something that we need to look at in future. All of this is really, really useful, but in the end of the day, the economics have to be taken into account of this, because if it's not economically viable, we're totally wasting our time. And we all know there's some benefits. In the organic scenario, we've calculated that a yield reduction of 15% would achieve a comparable crop margin. So if you can see, we're not currently at an economic position, and this does account for all of the additional costs, the seed and the drilling, and that also accounts for all the savings. So less weed harrowing and no ploughing or tillage. In a conventional context, this would also include any savings on the need to reseed every year for your cover crops between combine crops, but also the potential to save on nitrogen fertilizer rates, chemical applications, etc. So potentially, once we can get some conventional farms to get the living mulches going, we've got some real positive directions we can go. Right, is the uncosted benefits of living mulches, and particularly benefits of soil health. That is a term that I hate to use, but it's the definition is really about whether the soil is functional. We've also looking at biodiversity increase. And if we look at the video, you've got bees, you've got insects, you've got beneficials, you've got flowering species, you've got a range of diversity within the crop, you've got a range of diversity below the ground. All of these things are very, very positive. The other big thing that this is possibly useful towards is that public goods that we are soon to be being paid for, certainly in England and in Scotland, possibly, depending on what the Scottish government goes. So there are other benefits that we can't put a value on. And as far as the trial is going, we have the next steps. So the trial is ongoing. We are in the third year now, and the organic farms that we've been looking at, rye has already been drilled on one of them, and the second one, which is the field on the right, will be drilled with spring beans going forward, because he wants to continue the arable rotation going through whilst leaving living mulch down. So you can also see on the picture, it's become a home for some partridges as well. So it's all good stuff. Hopefully, we will also get non-organic farm trial plots established, and the trial will then continue on them as well. And for that reason, one of the things we've done this autumn is we started a new trial using autumn planting of the living mulch crop in order to get it up and growing strong enough to be able to survive the competition effect from potentially a thicker crop. During all of this, the farmers involved in the trial are free to manage the mulch however they want to do. So, for example, the farmer in Shropshire has got sheep, so he's grazing his living mulches. Farmer in Oxfordshire doesn't, so he's been topping it, possibly using a grass harrow and leaving it to develop as it should do. One big question we're getting is how can we harvest this nitrogen that is produced? Because we know the nitrogen is being produced by the clover and it's free, but what we need to do is make it available to the combinable crops. So as part of this trial, we are also looking at ways of managing this living mulches, possibly through Interrow mowing.
I'm Harry Henderson and I work for the HDB, kind of known as the machinery person. I have a background in machinery and used to work for a major manufacturer before joining HDB. I got involved and I'm kind of interested in no-till and direct drilling, and make a differentiation between direct drilling, it could be time-based, and no-till, which is going to be no soil movement whatsoever. It came to light in the spring if you've got a well-established living mulch, clover-based, and you establish either winter or spring cereal. The well-established clover crop tends to overrun the cereal crop. So then thoughts turned, could we mow it? Something that you could go in there with the machine and mow, just Interrow mow the clover, leave the wheat alone, and that would enable the wheat really to thrive and get a canopy above the clover, and then it outcompetes the clover is the holy grail, I suppose. So we did some research. I did some Googling and came up with the underground Agricultureromo. And this is a business in the States, in the US. They have a system called the Romo. It fits down a row of maize, grain maize, or a corn as they call it over there. As you can see, a reciprocating knife system, which is shaft driven, vertical shaft going down, and then you've got a very short section of reciprocating knife just to snip off the living mulches as you go. And that's for interrow mowing maize. And there's organisations in the States that are really looking at permanent ground cover for maize. And that would work fine. We discussed this at the Living Mulch meeting back last summer. There was some concern that this would need sharpening and would be quite high maintenance. But I think, to be fair, it would work very well. It's a quite low power consumption, and it would just snip off the growing clover as you go. Of course, this would be fairly dependent on a guidance system, GPS. You could do it freehand by eye, but of course, any deviation from what you're intending to mow can start to mow the crop that you're intending to harvest at some point. So it's fairly important to get either RTK or guidance of some description, or you're just good at concentrating, then probably in a good shape. These guys, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Organization over in the States, they started looking at interrow mowing. And you can see this is an experimental interrow mower. And what you've got is 8 little mowers, hydraulically driven, that would go in between the rows of maize. And you can see that would just keep the living mulch to a manageable state and allowing the maize to go up through it. So people got, well, okay, this is what we need to do in the UK. We can get this working. There's 1 or 2 guys who have got an operational interrow mower working in the UK. But as an opening gambit, really, this is the interrow mower for living mulch work in maize in the US. Hydraulic drive, you can see all the pipes and tanks in the middle and the big filter and so on, and that's how that would work. And then you can see there's another view of the same sort of machine. You can see the yellow mower decks, and we're looking back to where the tractor would be fitted through the machine. You can see the rows where the maize passes through and the mower decks that it gets mown. To be fair, this law looks pretty exciting. It's something that we could bring over here, but there's a little bit of a blockage, I think, to this type of system. I just picked this up off the internet, and what I wanted to try and illustrate was the row spacing. You can see that we've got 13-inch row spacings, or 33 centimeters, between each row of wheat as we've drilled it. Now, that's probably the widest. I think it's the Missouri Pro-Till seed drill in the UK, which has a 33 centimeter row spacing. And then the seeds are drilled or put into the ground in a band as well. So the row spacing for wheat is substantially smaller than it would for maize and for soybeans and for cotton rows. Okay, then we go a little bit narrower. We could say the Horsch Avatar no-till drill is set at 25 centimeters, and that does put the rows of corn, rows of wheat, rows of cereals in a fine row. So we've got 25 centimeters. And if you allow for a little bit of margin over error, so let's give the row of wheat drilled by a 25 centimeter row spacing, 5 centimeters per row, then we're getting to 20 centimeters between each row of wheat. So suddenly you start to get a very, very small mower unit if we're going to interrow mow in between wheat. We could do work on going to wide row wheat, but of course then the yield starts to go down. We probably want a bit of coverage from the canopy of the wheat as well to try and suppress the advancing clover. And so there's a little bit of a balance, a little bit of a battle going on between where do we have the wheat row spacings. It could be 25 centimetres. It could be wider to allow a mowing machine to get in between. If it goes any narrower, then I don't think it's reasonably economic to have a machine which with so many mowers, considering how they are driven. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's going to take a couple of cups of coffee to work this one out. We spoke to a couple of people about how it will be driven. Hydraulic drive is okay, but in this kind of frequency of mower, it's going to get expensive. Could electric work, electric drive, brushless motors that Dyson are very keen on with the hoovers? Yes, certainly that makes things cheaper. You have a small generator on, driven by the tractor PTO, and each of the mower units is electrically driven. But again, it's a 20 centimeter mowing unit, which is maybe uneconomic to try and construct. I know that there's a couple of farmers that have used a beet topper. You can get a sugar beet topper that tops the bolters, that hovers above the growing crop of sugar beet, and it just tops off any bolters. And there's a couple of farmers have adapted one of those to have shields that would sweep down the rows of wheat, mow the clover that's still growing, and the wheat springs up after the mower has passed. And perhaps that's a different way of thinking about it, where at a certain growth stage, you can still sweep the wheat down under, say, an upturned gutter, plastic guttering, and then the wheat springs back up when the tractor has passed. So there's ways and means of doing it. But I think all of these options, they take a bit of tractoring, they take a bit of cost to take the machine, to build the machine. If we're thinking that we need an experimental Interrow mower or topper that would get the clover checked back a little bit, then what are the limitations? Of course, if we have a mower that sweeps down the wheat, tops the clover, the wheat springs up, then there's a certain time when you won't be able to do that without damaging the crop when it grows on. And hopefully then the wheat would be able to get away and provide enough canopy to bring the advancing clover under control. Another way of thinking about this is Underground Agriculture, again, a US company. I've got the Interrow, and this is an Interrow roller crimper. Now you can see this is just one unit. Can't remember how wide this is, but this is going to be 15 inches, probably 40 centimeters wide. You would attach a whole gang of these, maybe 10, 12 or more, on a toolbar that would be attached to the tractor, and you'd go down the field, and instead of mowing the living mulch, you'd actually crimp it. And this roller with the blades on just crimps the crop into the ground, checks it back. The wheat crop slides down either side of this roller, and it escapes being crimped. And then it's just another way of doing it. Much more simple, no more motors, hydraulic or electric, and mower units and so forth. But it might just check the living mulch back enough to allow the wheat or oats or rye cash crop to grow up. It's a bit of a conundrum. There's two other options. You can send the sheep in, which might be okay if you're set up for sheep. Not everyone is. Not everyone wants to get into sheep. And then people say, what on earth are we going to do with these sheep if everyone starts growing sheep on a living mulch environment? So it opens a whole other course of conversation as well if you add livestock into the situation. Then is it varietal? Is there a variety of clover that's low growing, that's very prostrate, it clings to the ground, it gets 5 inches high, and that'll do, and then your cereal crop is able to grow through it? As a medium for a no-till drill to work in, a clover living mulch is ideal. It's superb. But it's just keeping that clover down and allowing the wheat crop to grow through. Now, this was an interesting thing. There is a bit of weed control available. This is a electric weeder that's available in the States. And on the back of the tractor, that's got the weed zapper. That contains a fairly high voltage or powerful generator. So the tractor of that size is needed. And then the bar on the front of the tractor are actually electrically charged. Any volunteer type crops that you don't want are electrocuted. with an electric shock, a visible arc that you can see from those two poles right at the very front of the toolbar on the front of the tractor. There's an actual physical arc that goes from those carbon poles to the plant. The plant gets electrocuted, the actual growing point is boiled, and it dies. So it's a chemical-free form of weed control. You'll notice that this isn't Interrow, but there's nothing to say that this couldn't be Interrow. But of course, the downside is we don't know. Obviously, the clover would get killed. Whether it would come back satisfactorily, we don't know. And whether you'd need to re-establish the clover every year, again, is another point. And that's one farmer in Oxfordshire is already doing that, is establishing a clover crop every year. But of course, that comes in with cost implications, I suppose. And is the clover crop going to nodulate if it's a young crop? Probably yes. Will it nodulate more if it's an older crop, well established? Perhaps. And it probably isn't quite a living mulch. It's a newly established mulch every time you go in with the seed drill to establish your cash crops. But I thought this photograph was just an illustration of some of the technology that's out there. And you've probably heard of electrocution of weeds already, but it can be made into Interrow electrocution as well. But of course, that could be fairly final for the living mulch.
Yeah, so we are in organic conversion just now, just in our second year, and grow roughly 50 hectares of mainly winter oats. And we used to have quite a long rotation time-wise. Organic obviously restricts us, so we're trying to get at least 3 cereal crops and then back into grass after that. And so I was trying to figure a way of putting a whole lot of ideas together that would help us throughout this rotation. Something that would reduce our tillage, preferably just try to get to ploughing once in each rotation, because just to get out of grass, try and reduce our time, the money involved, and how much fuel we use as well. But at the same time, increase the diversity of crop, having at least, well, the oats and the clover, and something to cover us over the winter as well. Something to help the ground hold up a bit better. Here in the Scottish borders, we can be quite wet, and it takes quite a bit to try and make the combine not make too much of a rut to then get the next, which means you have to then plough again. So if we can just plough out of grass the once, it keeps things firmer. And we kind of wanted these fields to be a multi-purpose, so we could harvest the crop in the end of the summer and then put fattening cattle on, as we don't have sheep, to tidy it up before we would then plant the next crop. Between harvest and planting, sometimes we don't have much more than 2 weeks. So it can be quite a quick push to get crops turned around, which makes a lot of people rely on the plough because it'll always work, but the plough comes with a lot of hold-ups as well. I'll just run through what we do and what we're planning to do. So we plough out our grass, plant our cereal crop, which is winter oats, and then we've been planting clover into that in the spring, and then do nothing else until harvest time, and then graze it. And then just now we're at a stage of direct drilling our first crop or second crop of the rotation. And then we're going to try and release the nitrogen. We're going to harrow the clover quite hard in the spring just to bash it up a bit, rather than, we've got GPS, but we've drill that we planted with got 16 centimetre row spacing, which is impossible for a mower pretty much. So if we can hash it with the harrows and then basically leave it till harvest and then do the same again the next year. And then after that, hopefully there's a good enough lay of clover that we would just direct drill a grass lay into it, which would last us the next 5 years. So the idea is to, in this 8-year rotation, or at least 8 years, that we will never plough the field once. That's kind of plans. The questions have got in my own head. With a living mulch underneath, can we get the straw dry enough in this area to bale it? It can be tricky enough at the best of times, but we managed fine this year, but we need to see about every other year. And if we don't get a good start of clover, how easy is it for the grass that we've only ploughed once to take over again? And also, if we're on a short rotation with organic and we're ploughing out our grass, that releases a lot of nitrogen. Is what we're doing worthwhile? Because we're getting a good crop of oats, and this year it almost turned out too good. The clover didn't establish that well. We've still got a lot of questions. As Jer said, we get a lot of answers out of the speaking to people. We're still early days, but it gets the mind thinking, because I know it's a bit of a holy grail trying to do this organically. Glyphosate would be a grand thing to knock back the clover, but for other reasons we've got no intention of using it. Yeah, that's what our ideas are just now.